I'm Gina Howell. I am from Southeastern Sustainability Center. Thank you all so much for joining. We're really excited to have Mr. Christopher here with us today. This will be a great talk. I haven't heard anything about this before, so I'm really excited. Just a little reminder that we will be recording today's presentation, and we'll post a link on the Green Talks online guide. So please be sure to mute your mic until the very end, and then we'll do a Q&A, and that would be awesome. So it would probably be another hour or so, and then we can just all start to talk in the chat. But if you haven't been to our talks before, we are actually on our third year of doing the Green Talk series. So we talked about everything from environmental literacy on campus, in our community, and renewable energies, and everything in between that. So today we are so happy to have Dr. Christopher Oliver. He is from Tulane, speaking to us about housing justice to environmental injustice, and specifically in the Gordon Plaza in the Agriculture Street Superfund Site in New Orleans. So welcome, Dr. Oliver.
Thank you. Let me know, can you hear me okay? Yeah, I'm really happy to be here and talk about some work that I've been doing over the last 6 years or so with the residents of Gordon Plaza, which is a community group that live on the Agricultural Superfund Site, and I'll kind of untangle all of that through the talk today. The talk is somewhat detailed at times, and it's always this interesting thing. I want to talk about environmental justice and issues of justice and the importance of what's happened to these people and how do you understand exactly what's happened to them over the last almost 40 years now. But there's a lot of details historically and kind of technically, some environmental science, although I won't talk a lot about that. I'm happy to answer questions about the more environmental science things as part of it. And so oftentimes it takes me a long time to get started and get people kind of caught up to speed about what's happening there. Some of you may know a little bit about it, but I'm always surprised, even colleagues of mine, people living in New Orleans, people who grew up in New Orleans have never even heard of it. And so that's why it's always an interesting thing that I always want to be able to talk about what's happening. And of course, the other thing is that this is still happening. This is ongoing. This is a community that's still dealing with these issues. And there are still people, somebody just died, I think about a month and a half ago, which is somewhere around the 40th person or so. And even that data is even hard for us to kind of put together, who've lived on this site and who've actually died due to most likely a cancer or some other related issue or illness caused by the site. So again, this is still happening. So I always want to be sure that at some point I can provide you with more details, and certainly I'll provide you with my information if you're interested in getting involved and meeting with community members or going to events or anything like that, anything you want to do. I'll probably provide that to Gina, and then you can share that with me. So let's get started here with the talk. So from housing justice to environmental injustice, I've done this talk many times, not this particular talk, but variations on this talk, and I changed the name slightly each time. And the one thing that we've been working on more recently is looking at the history of how the residents came to live on this site. And I'll talk more about this in detail, but the idea was this was to provide for affordable housing for residents in the city of New Orleans going back, starting in the 1960s, and in this case, the late 70s, 1980s. That was a set of programs, federal programs, that were filtered through the city and set up, again, to provide affordability for housing, in the case of Gordon Plaza specifically, so they could actually purchase homes, right? And that's why the American dream, and we'll talk more about that in a second, that turned into an environmental injustice, or as the residents often say, and so we'll talk more about that in a second. So just a quote to start with, and just to give you a kind of context, this is looking out from the president of the residents of Gordon Plaza, Shannon Rainey, who's been a resident there for about 20 years. This is looking directly across the street back in and before 2019 at the former Press Park developments. And this is what it looked like, and all of the housing that had been abandoned post-Katrina, that's not Gordon Plaza, was part of Press Park, which were townhomes and apartments. I'll talk about when this was finally cleaned up after, almost a decade and a half. But this is basically what she looked out on every day when she walked out in front of her house. So this is a quote going back to, and I believe this is quoted in the Times Pick in 2018, and I think this meeting happened in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. And to quote Shannon, he sat in my living room and he said that if he had a choice, he'd build a jail before he relocated us, she remembered. Well, he did that, built a jail. but he's still allowing us to live on a landfill. He don't give a damn about it at all. Excuse the expression, excuse me. And again, I heard this the first time probably only a couple months after I met Shannon, and I was going to meetings with the community group at her house, and she mentioned this in passing a couple of times, and it continued over time until the point where I finally did ask her directly again, like, did he say it exactly this way? And she said, this is almost exactly what he said. And the idea that actually, the mayor of New Orleans, right, a Democrat and a progressive in many ways, right, would actually refer to a jail in conjunction with an environmental justice and environmental racism issue is staggering. And so when I hear this, I still can't believe it, but I've heard it from multiple people who actually were there. Here's a picture of Shannon. This is her standing in front of her house, which is just across the street, at one of the events about a year and a half ago. So just a little context on that. So today, I'm going to talk about environmental injustices as issues of social justice and civil rights. We'll talk a little bit about human rights. This is I'll just preface all of this with this kind of short introduction to those issues. Talk a little bit about what justice is, at least how we frame it in the context of environmental justice, and why that's important, and why as the field, as an academic field of study moves forward, but also as a framework for advocacy and activism, and also the legal framework as well, of which I'm not a lawyer, but I'm learning a great deal about the law. I work with the environmental law clinic here at New Orleans, or at Tulane, and so I'm getting to understand more clearly some of the important legal issues associated with it, but I'm more of the academic side of things. A history of the Gordon Plaza site, which will include Agriculture Street landfill, and the history of the landfill, which goes back over 100 years. The housing developments on the site itself. And I'll talk both about the housing that existed prior to these housing developments, and then these particular housing developments were built by the city starting in the late 60s and through the 1980s. Gordon Plaza in particular, and Motown Elementary School, which is just adjacent and literally across the street from Shannon's house as well. And then we'll talk about the Agriculture Street Superfund Site and what was done to partially remediate the site, and kind of many of the shortcomings and failings of the EPA and LDEQ as well. Then we'll talk about Gordon Plaza today. I have some maps to show you, some photos, and we'll look at some of the site from above to get a sense of what it looks like. So environmental injustice is issues of social justice. I always say that I do work in social justice and environmental justice. There's reasons why maybe we can separate the two, but certainly I think environmental injustice comes under an issue of social justice. The other issue is the issue of environmental justice versus environmental injustice. When I teach classes on this, we always have discussions about what's the distinction. And I think part of it is it's oftentimes easier for us to recognize what injustice is, and a little more difficult for us to think about the term justice more broadly, certainly, again, from a philosophical, moral, and ethical, but even from a legal, practical, policy-oriented stance. But we'll talk a little bit about that. So social justice and civil rights, so social inequality and stratification certainly play into this, the housing part of it, but even what happened and the consequences to the people living on the site, and how these things are interrelated. And that's one thing I hope that when you come away from this talk, is you'll think about the historical legacy of inequality that has existed for hundreds of years in the United States and hundreds of years in New Orleans and Louisiana, and how what happened to the residents over the last 40 years is really part of that whole legacy. There may be different things happening and different actors and different players and different groups, but really it's still part of a trajectory that still exists today, even in 2020. And certainly that is clear by the fact that nothing happened in terms of helping these residents deal with the issues that they've been dealing with for 40 years. Environmental justice and injustice. And again, I kind of gloss over this. We'll talk a little bit. We'll talk about it in the context of how the EPA and the federal government defines these things. And then at the end, we can talk a little bit more about what that means. Environmental racism and how that fits into it, and what's the relationship with the idea of race and the importance of racial equity and racial equality. I talk a little bit about class in here, and certainly that's interrelated with this. Of which kind of the umbrella environmental justice maybe kind of brings those together and kind of in conversation. But the issue of justice, which is, a couple years ago, I was putting together a class to teach on justice, and went round and round. We were supposed to do a multi-team, multi-professor approach to it. And it was very interesting in doing so and trying to talk cross disciplines. It was hard for us to even understand, like, how do we define what justice is? How do we teach about what justice is? It's just a multifaceted and important, but also in some ways troubling, because of the difficulty of actually defining and coming to an agreement about what justice is. Certainly, I think equality, fairness, and access to opportunity is something that we could agree upon. I think I certainly, from an academic and even from policy-oriented stance, equity, distributive fairness, right, and resources, economic, legal, political, social, right. Again, we have these definitions, but then once you parse them out and begin to kind of play with them, it becomes much more difficult to try to understand fully. Social justice, human rights, and civil rights. And interestingly enough, oftentimes the human rights literature and the civil rights literature are not always in conversation with each other. And certainly that's true also of social justice and human rights. It depends on where and who's working in what fields and what we're talking about. There have been pushes at various times to use human rights literature and human rights legal standing to force the government, local government, state governments, the federal government to actually remedy some environmental injustices. Civil rights has more often been applied to that until actually the foundation of environmental justice within the context of federal law. And we'll talk about that in a second. So what are they trying to do? What are we looking at in terms of something that we're trying to challenge or oppose? Obviously, systemic and structural racism is part of this, for sure. There's a lot more to human rights and civil rights than just this, but this is kind of foundational in many ways. Institutional racism, which is one that I find difficult both to explain and even as a researcher to kind of parse out the issue of what's structural and systemic racism versus institutional racism. Certainly we can see it in the context of things like policies, right, and directives and these kinds of things. I teach in the area of organizational sociology, so we talk about organizational culture and the importance of that, and that certainly relates to institutional racism. And certainly when we talk about things like redlining and other kinds of policies historically that have basically kept individuals, because of race, because of ethnicity, in some cases because of gender and sexuality and other kinds of things, from opportunities, right? Certainly in housing in particular. And really all forms of injustice. And again, something that I feel like is often easier for us to define, that this clearly is an injustice if it's harming somebody and not providing for particular opportunities in some way. So prior to 1990, all issues, really the 1990s, late 80s, maybe all issues of environmental justice fell under civil rights legislation and laws. So the use of the 1960s, the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s often were applied in certain instances to issues that were related to the environment. For those of you who don't know, there was not much on the books federally in terms of environmental protection and regulation until the 1970s, right, in NEPA and the US EPA. And it really isn't until the 1980s when you get a series of legislation, congressional acts that actually institute very specific rules and regulations in which some of these things begin to actually happen and filter down to kind of state and local level. And I say that, and as I tell my students all the time, is, the one thing that happened is we passed NEPA and we passed the EPA and we began to put in congressional legislation. And then immediately, when Reagan becomes president in the 1980s, he begins to defund the US EPA, defund the Superfund site that's just beginning, Superfund program. And throughout the entire 80s, there's a constant tension and undermining through the federal administration, through Reagan. That means that even what gains were made with great difficulty during that time. 1990s come, and this is when we really see the creation of kind of defined aspects of environmental justice in federal and in some cases in state laws. Now, in some cases, states were actually more progressive and ahead of the federal government, and that created other kinds of tensions. But for the most part, federal legislation doesn't happen until the 1990s. In terms of what went on outside of this, and this is really one of the most important, you can go back to the 1980s and look at particular incidents, and certainly here in Louisiana and the founding of the environmental justice movement here. But it is until 1991 that we have kind of a national level movement around the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, in which you get community and religious leaders together to begin to talk about this issue around civil rights and environmental racism. And and as similar to all over the entire country, but here in Louisiana, of course, religious leaders have always been instrumental in working with community activists and advocates in pushing for these issues. And then in 1994, you get the first real federal movement with Executive Order 12898 under President Clinton that actually mandates that the federal government must take into consideration issues of race and ethnicity in conjunction with any federal agency actions, and certainly within the context of anything related to environmental justice in particular. So what is environmental injustice? EJ concerns: access to clean water, air, soil, etc., physical environment free of contamination of pollution hazards. Very clearly defined in terms of what that means. Of course, how it plays out is very complex for a variety of reasons. US EPA and actually define this as fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with regard to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Same degree of protection from hazards regardless of issues of race, color, national origin, or income, right? Interestingly enough, gender is not included in this, and this is always an interesting aspect of what that means, since so many of the different residents that I've met with and talked with, and those who are active are typically women, oftentimes women who have had particular health issues that have something to do with reproductive health in particular. And so always be thinking about the importance of that within this. Equal access to decision-making process. So, and this is the one that I think is really important. Certainly we probably you read or heard a lot about things that have been happening with disenfranchisement of voter rights and these kinds of things. Certainly including people in the decision-making process has not really happened at the kind of meaningful way that it should. And certainly at the state level, that's been true, and at the local level as well. So environmental justice, and I have equal here. I don't mean exactly equal per se, but the linking between the two: environmental justice, social justice, and human and civil rights. The big thing is, when we think about these issues, we have to always think about how there's different and complex issues, but they're very much intertwined and related. And we have to understand the importance of what that means. And I certainly think about, we have to use whatever resources at our disposal, kind of ethically for sure, morally, but certainly from a legal and policy standpoint. So that's why I kind of am bringing these things together. And that isn't always the case, and that certainly isn't really necessarily the case even at this point in terms of how work gets done. All right, now I'll talk just briefly about the site and the people, and I'm just going to lay out the players. So it's there's a lot going on. So please, by all means, if you have questions at the end, I can go back and try to identify these. There's just a lot going historically, over this like 60-year period. So the site is in the New Orleans Desire neighborhood, which I've done a lot of work archivally to try to figure out exactly when people begin to live in this area in kind of a more sustained way. Certainly there have been people in this region for a very long time, but around the late part of the 19th century, you really begin to see neighborhoods beginning to pop up in this area. And certainly by the 20th century, you actually begin to see it in the record and see it in like Times Pick, et cetera, talking about Desire as a particular neighborhood. The Agriculture Street landfill site became an actual landfill for the city in 1909. But there had been dumping going on in this area for at least 2 decades prior to that. I'll talk a little bit about that. Closed in 1958, and I'll talk about the history of why the site closed and then kind of what happened after. The housing developments, I'm going to talk mainly Gordon Plaza, but this is a public-funded multi-stage housing development: Liberty Terrace, Press Park, and Gordon Plaza. 1970s, 80s, I'm going to show a little bit about the foundation of why the 1960s were instrumental and what happened, but it was 1970s and 80s when you saw the development of this housing, of these particular developments. The Moton Elementary School, which opened in 1987 and closed in 1994, and we'll talk more about that. The community groups involved, the first iteration and a very long, drawn-out lawsuit that lasted almost 20 years involved a citizen group called Concerned Citizens of Agriculture Street. The most recent group is called the Residents of Gordon Plaza. There's some overlap between the two. Certainly a number of residents who have been there since the 1980s were actively involved in the original group and now are part of the Residents of Gordon Plaza. Some people chose not to be part of this more recent iteration because of some of the issues around the lawsuit and the fact that most people have not seen any of the money that they want in the award. And then there have been a number of people who moved into the site more recently since the 1990s, including Shannon Rainey. And so that's why she got involved and eventually became president of the Residents of Gordon Plaza. To give you an idea where this site is, it's not the best map. I need to create another one. I apologize. Hopefully you can see this. See, here's the French Quarter. I kind of have identified here with the red. This is the Marigny Bywater. Up in here is the Florida projects, housing developments, and this is the old Desire projects. Just to the kind of west is Ag Street in this area, and you can actually see this green space here. This is the undeveloped part of the site that was originally proposed to be an initial housing development, but never actually came to fruition. And then you can, this is the area where the site is. I'm gonna have a more detailed map. Tulane's way down here, uptown, if you're familiar with New Orleans. So it's roughly 4 miles from the French Quarter and about 5 miles, and roughly 3 miles from the river. So Agriculture Street landfill site opened in 1909, and this was to replace the Silver City Clio Street landfill, which was near Central City. And actually, I can go back to the map and show you real quickly. I'm working on actually these 3 sites, and actually Saratoga, which is down here, is another one. This is a whole nother kind of similar situation, unfortunately, with housing development and a high school that was built on the Silver City Clio site, which was the landfill prior to Ag Street. So Ag Street actually replaced this one. Again, Desire neighborhood in 9th Ward. Municipal waste site. The terminology is interesting. Most of the stuff I'm getting is from archival, newspapers. They don't delineate between hazardous waste and solid waste back then. Basically, municipal waste was city services, businesses, residences, and industry. But prior to 1980, really, and certainly prior to even state legislation in the 1970s, most municipalities didn't really discern between what we call now solid waste versus hazardous waste. So closed in 1958 and 1959, and this is a little bit of discrepancies on when it closed exactly, in part between legal versus illegal dumping. Again, part of it was because of the process in which you had to get permission to dump and what that meant, which was pretty loose back then. Reopened briefly in 1965 to dispose of the waste after Hurricane Betsy. In fact, most, if not all of the waste, in my understanding, actually went into the landfill for basically most of the communities that were affected by Hurricane Betsy in particular. And this was a key moment, at least I've been told from people who were around then and involved in the process, that the city loosened the existing restrictions and basically allowed people to dump whatever they wanted into the landfill following Hurricane Betsy. And so I've heard there are multiple vehicles in there. There's all kinds of other hazardous waste that was completely dumped in there. And one big thing to remember that during this time, they weren't really tracking the type of waste that was going into the landfill. So things that were going in, they don't even know exactly what was being placed in the landfill, and there was little regulation at all, or records actually, on what was happening. So the public housing developments, Liberty Terrace, Pretz Park, Gordon Plaza housing developments. They opened in stages from the early 1970s to early 1980s. Gordon Plaza was 78 was the first initial stage. The second one was in 1980 and 81. And the one I'm talking about is really that second stage one, which was the detached homes that were purchased by residents. This is adjacent to the former Desire housing development, which was a large scale multi-unit housing development as part of the public housing program for New Orleans that was started in the 1940s. Today, after Katrina, the housing development was raised, and now they're called the estates, which are kind of low-rise dispersed housing at a much lower density for sure. Now, the Liberty Terrace, Press Park, and Gordon Plaza were funded through federal programs and community development block grants, and I'm going to talk about why that second part's really important. So, initially I was told that this was coming again in the 1970s and early 80s, but as I started doing archival research, I really started looking as far back as the 1950s. The city was considering turning the landfill, especially after it was closed, and there was a lot of push to close it by the mid-50s, into some kind of housing development. And there's a number of reasons why that's the case. But in conjunction with this, in 1964, President Johnson initiated his war on poverty. And so while the city was interested in developing and putting housing in this area, there was also now this opportunity for federal programs and federal funding to facilitate this. And so 1964 was the Demonstration Cities and Metropolitan Act, which created the Model Cities program, of which New Orleans was one of these. And this designated cities to receive federal funding to, and I quote from both the actual act itself as well as a lot of the policies that came out of it, to populated isolated regions of cities in areas, and there was a measure of less than 20% by some measure, of which it was really difficult still for me to understand exactly how they were measuring that. and to support disadvantaged communities and groups. So in a combination of providing kind of more dispersed populations in cities that have isolated areas. And so in a number of places, St. Louis, Chicago, Philadelphia, I believe Los Angeles, Seattle, and I think Oakland were a part of this as well. And what this did is allowed for federal community development block grants, what we call now part of the Community Development Block Grant Program, which provides grants to cities and then allow for these municipalities to make decisions about how to disperse those funds within certain guidelines. And again, these guidelines are usually set up by the particular program. And this does a number of things. This allows cities to make decisions kind of internally, right, and locally, which is important. But interestingly enough, what it also does is it provides a little insulation. And I say this in looking at it from the lawsuit that's currently underway with the federal government against the federal government. It kind of insulates the federal government from some of that responsibility. Whether that was intended or not is a really good question. But certainly that's kind of the byproduct of providing for this funding. So at some level it makes sense because of course you want local municipalities to make local decisions. And I think that makes perfect sense. But again, it kind of adds that layer between the federal and state government and the local government. So even though housing development in Gordon Plaza was not initiated until really the late 70s, foundation and planning had started as early as the late 50s and 60s and 70s. And you can see this play out in a variety of things. I actually had tried to find, we have in some of our online stuff, one of the city council members who eventually became mayor in the 1960s, standing on top of Ag Street while it's burning behind him, declaring that he's going to turn this into a suburban development someday. And so it was clear by I think it was 57 is when the picture was taken, that they already had eyes on basically converting this into some kind of housing development, as a suburban housing development within the city. So Robert Motown Elementary School, and it's a little convoluted. I'll come back and kind of lay out the foundation of this, but it's important to understand because this elementary school was a catalyst for allowing the community to really see what was happening. And I'll tell you why in a second. This was opened in 1987. And again, it was opened in and adjacent to the Gordon Plaza development in particular. It was promised to the community as part of the development because there was some isolation in this area in which there's not a lot of services and there weren't a lot of there weren't existing educational facilities that would accommodate this huge new development, with something like 3,000 units total. And so they said they would open the elementary school there. There's also a high school that still actually is there, which again, leading to the idea that in 2020, things have not changed. But this elementary school was particularly important. Closed in 1994, and I'll come back to that in a second. The children that went there were Black, low income, mostly from these nearby public housing developments from Gordon Plaza, Press Park, and Liberty Terrace, as well as from the Desire neighborhood in and around that area. Late 1980s. Initially leading up to the opening of the school, there had actually already been some concerns about illnesses, especially around what was appeared to be lead poisoning of residents living in the area. The other thing is, in talking to the residents, and I think in my clip it's gonna show a little bit about this. Residents were talking about going out and digging gardens in their yard and having trash literally come to the surface and stuff pop up, like bottles of things that clearly were dangerous chemicals in some cases. And so people already had a good idea, but they were also seeing, again, the manifestation of illnesses associated with this contamination. And so in the school itself, like early on, there was concerns before it was open. But interestingly enough, there was also a push by the community. They actually thought that the city was backing out on the promise of opening the elementary school, and this is what was happening. So there was even some tensions early on within the community itself about whether contamination was really an issue, whether illness is really an issue, or whether the city was actually using this as a guise to not build the school. So there was still a big push to get the school open. So it did open, within a couple of years. In fact, I've heard as early as a year, you begin to see some of the manifestation of children's getting lead poisoning. And I've read some stuff and seen some things on, there might have been lead in the water itself, but certainly lead was in the soil in and around the playgrounds where they were playing. And there's still high level in and around the facility today. Community group raises alarms as early as 1988 to both the city and eventually to the US EPA that this is a problem, and that it's children who are being exposed to these things as well as other community members. But the school remained open until 1994, was closed around the time of Ag Street when it was listed on the Superfund site, which I'll talk about in a second. Historically, again, this area was considered a back area swamp, and I put that in quotes because I find it so interesting when you see different federal and certainly like newspaper articles written about the site. You know, it's this kind of Netherlands that is this often portrayed as parts of New Orleans, right? This kind of back area and swamp. But there were people living in and around this neighborhood, definitely going back to the turn of the century, the 20th century, probably going back another 20 or 30 years before that. So there were community members in this area, but it still was seen as kind of, again, this back area that needed to be developed. And as part of the city, if you know the history of the development of the city, this was hugely important in terms of the expanding population and the shifting and kind of internal migration of people within the city. 1909, again, the municipal land site is actually formally declared, and waste is being shipped from downtown by rail predominantly during this time. 1958, city closes landfill due to numerous complaints about odors, pests, and fires. And if you go through the literature, you can hear, you know, rats everywhere, you know, cockroaches, all kinds of stuff, flies that just impossible for people to basically live, even though there were a lot of people living in this area. The site was nicknamed Dante's Inferno. I think the first time I read that it came up was in the early 1950s, maybe as late as 1940. No, I think it was late 1940s, actually. 1965, again, temporarily reopens and permanently closed again, though illegal dumping continues. And in fact, a couple of my students, against my better judgment, went out on the site a couple different times to take pictures, and you can actually see some clearly recent, like less than 5 years old dumping that still happens on the site. Here's a picture from the Times-Picayune from 2015 on a story, and this is taken in 1949. And so again, you can see the burning fires kind of smoldering. This is around the extent, as far as we know, of where dumping was taking place during that time. And you can see here where it runs along here. And still at the same time, you can see kind of dense housing existing in and around what's going on. You can't see back here, but there's housing that would be both like back to our left as well as back behind us from this picture. I'm going to come back to this picture, and we're going to look at it, how it looks today in conjunction with this picture. So again, in the 1970s, City of New Orleans and the Housing Authority of New Orleans begin to seek sites for affordable public housing developments by using federal funds. So kind of a coalescing of this model cities program in the 1960s with a huge push in the 1970s with federal funding to expand affordable housing in cities that needed it, which New Orleans was one that was definitely on the radar for the federal government. So Liberty Terrace and Press Park was initially set up. These were affordable low-income rental homes and townhomes. And then Gordon Plaza housing development, again, 1978 and then 1980. These were both affordable low-income rental apartment complex of 128 units and then single-family homes for purchase. And that's the key, because all of the other developments have been shut down. Most didn't shut down until post-Katrina. But the families that actually purchased these homes starting in the 1980s are still, I mean, in many cases, still the residents who purchased early in the 1980s. In some cases, it's children of the original residents who purchased, and often that's the case. And then in some cases, we have people who purchased homes more recently. In fact, there was a sale actually that just happened last year, which the residents were completely appalled by, that somebody actually sold their unit to a new family. That's a whole nother story. But one thing about Gordon Plaza, and I say this because this comes up in conversation all the time with the residents, is they don't see themselves as low income, and that's true. They were definitely working middle class residents, and they were discriminated against. Their parents were discriminated against, their grandparents were discriminated against in terms of actually be able to get mortgages, right? And so this was an opportunity for them to kind of overcome those kinds of racist policies, that allowed them to purchase. And as they say, this is like the American dream. This is a chance for them to actually become part of home ownership in the United States. It's this kind of central feature, right, for what generational wealth, etc. In the mid-1980s, residents, again, complaining about pollution and health issues, they asked the city to step in and begin monitoring for contamination. The DEQ determines that that even though there's lead, there's arsenic, there's zinc, there's mercury, there's a number of things that are coming up in some of the testing. They are acceptable based on CDC standards during that time. There's some issues with how the testing was done, who did the testing. There's a number of things that come up in terms of like what was happening during that time. I'm kind of looking at that. We're kind of in the process of trying to examine that kind of historical scientific data during the 1980s. But it's determined that it's safe, right? They say basically this is safe based on CDC and EPA standards within the site, so everything should just continue as is. Moton Elementary School opens in 1987. Again, there's some testing. 900 students between 6 and 12 years old on this site. 1986, city and US EPA inspectors test the site, again, in part because of what was going on previously with the Gordon Plaza developments and Press Park, but also because of what was happening with the students at the Moton Elementary School in particular. And the site, again, is not sufficient to warrant cleanup. 1993, there's another push, a great deal of public pressure, predominantly coming from parents in relationship to children at the Moton School, but also from a number of different people across all these developments. Finally, the US EPA inspectors come back and retest the site. They determine there's 140 toxic contaminants, with 49 that are listed as probable or likely carcinogens on this site. So we're not talking about a mildly polluted site. This is like Love Canal, this is like one of the most contaminated sites, certainly in Louisiana and probably in the country. Unfortunately, probably not the only one in the country, just many that we don't know about with former landfills, but certainly in terms of what EPA has documented on the site, one of the most contaminated. 1994, Ag Street site is formally listed as part of the Superfund program, so on the MPL, and is given funding for cleanup. Also, the same year, Executive Order 12898 is signed. Interestingly enough, nobody really talks about the relationship between the two. I certainly think, and I would love to talk, I haven't had a chance to talk with EPA officials during that time. I suspect that under the executive order, I know that they went back and began to look at previously examined sites to see if there were issues of environmental justice, environmental racism, of which the site clearly would fit that. And so I think that might have had at least some role to play in the eventual listing of the site on the NPL. So what is Superfund? I don't know how much you all know about Superfund, so I'll just talk about it very briefly. It was established in 1980 under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, more commonly referred to as the Superfund Act. And oftentimes my students want to know why it's Superfund, but it's not. It's actually Superfund. So just to be clear, establishes national priorities list. This is a list of contaminated sites determined by testing protocols and procedures and other determinants to make it eligible for funds as part of the Superfund program. Just because you qualified to be on the national priorities list does not mean that you actually will receive funds. And that's one thing to always understand, in part because the program has struggled for a very long time and is nearly insolvent in many ways. And so that's one big thing. So the US EPA determines which sites then receive funding, which is often a very political process, but that's for another conversation. And also created the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is an advisory non-regulatory agency to track toxic substances and health consequences, to work in conjunction with the EPA to determine both sites and then also monitor those sites after cleanup. So 1997-98, many residents wanted to be relocated. City and federal government refuses. They say that Superfund program itself will do remediation, and this should make it safe. They began a $20 million remediation of the site in 1998. They removed 2 feet of topsoil, but do not remediate anything underneath existing developments, so under the homes, roads, sidewalks, schools, etc. Estimates indicate toxic soil and waste are 20 feet deep at the site, so needless to say, covering up what was there. One big thing is a lot of residents refuse to allow the EPA to actually come on their property. So it was really kind of a patchwork quilt of cleanup, so that you might have cleanup on one site and right next door there was no cleanup. I'm not an environmental scientist, even though I have a background in it. It's clearly not the best way to do things, given that obviously things migrate, especially in New Orleans, where we have a water table that's very high and have a great deal of flooding, right, as you may know. 2005 Hurricane Katrina comes in, floods the sites roughly 6 to 8 feet deep with water. In the aftermath of this, Hannah decides to close all of the city-owned properties, but the residents themselves stay because, again, they purchased their homes and they have their equity built in those homes, and certainly they have vested interest in staying. And many of them really liked the community and wanted to stay in many ways, and so that was a big part of it. 2006, the residents actually reinitiate a lawsuit that was started in the 1990s to sue both Hano and the Orleans Civil District, or the Orleans Parish, for both the development of the school and the housing developments. Eventually, the lawsuit is dismissed, and then they appeal this. Finally, in 2015, a state court orders defendants to pay $14.2 million to the residents. $7 million of it goes to the lawyers right away. If anybody knows, if you know anything about environmental litigation, that usually the residents only get a portion of that. The lawyers, the mediators, the judges, that are part of it, oftentimes make a great deal of money off of that. $7.1 million was split between 5,000 residents. So everybody who lived historically in the site, roughly $1,500 per resident. Some residents said that they received up to $4,000. There are a lot of residents that said even to this day they've received nothing. And so there's actually an ongoing litigation battle about what happened with that money that's happening independent of the newest lawsuit. We know that post-Katrina, Wilma Subra, who works for Louisiana Environmental Action Network, has done extensive testing over the last decade and a half. The site is still heavily contaminated with heavy metals, lead, mercury, zinc, arsenic. Again, all of the dioxins, all the things that the EPA found originally has now been spread out over the entire site after Katrina in particular, but probably was already moving due to flooding and the water table itself. April 2018, this newest group, the residents of Gordon Plaza, filed a lawsuit against the former mayor Landreau and the city of New Orleans, and that's because he was mayor at the time, under the RCRA, which was the Resource Conservation, and I can never forget the RCRA, but anyway, federal legislation to basically protect individuals regarding environmental toxins. And this lawsuit is still pending as a judge's decision regarding the issue of standing. So it's been held up in the courts now for almost 2 years. In fact, it's been with this judge for well over a year. 2019, we saw some of the first data coming out of the Louisiana Tumor Registry, in which you had actually census tract level data, and the census tract where the residents live is the second highest rate of cancers in Louisiana, and honestly one of the highest rates in the United States as well. So this really, the residents felt very vindicated by this data, which was something that they knew was going on, and oftentimes, in the history of tracking cancers in the state of Louisiana, but in general, oftentimes is not done well, and certainly not providing good fine-grained data. So this was really important. Here's the site. I just have a couple of maps that I'm almost done. Again, I know that it's a lot of details. This is looking at the site using Google Earth, and this is looking lakeside, if you know Louisiana, looking from the river. And you can see over here on the left, you've got the site that's undeveloped still. You've got the existing Gordon Plaza and the former sites here, and I've got a little bit of detail. This is the Ag Street landfill boundary from the best that we can determined from documents from the city. And again, when back in 1909 and before that, there was just no detailed records about and land survey about what was going on. It wasn't until the 1950s that you saw some of this. There is possibility the boundary extended out to all the way up to here, and this is certainly in terms of like illegal dumping that was happening throughout the last century or so. I've got these here. You've got Liberty Terrace over here, which was the initial development. You've got this blue area, which is the Press Park apartments and townhomes. Here's the Moton School, and then this is Gordon Plaza. This over here was a retirement community for low income that now actually is a new apartment development. And over here is where the former Desire housing development was, which is now called the Estates and still is there. So in between there's still this whole community here, and it's very interesting because I've asked the residents if they've had conversations with this community, and there really hasn't been much connection or communication between the people living in this area, even though they've been there for generations. Again, looking at this site, this picture, again, this is looking towards the river, looking towards downtown. You can kind of see the French Quarter and CBD. Here's a picture today. I just got this off Google Earth. So this is relatively new. and you can see where the housing development is today. And I actually drew this in. You can see, and I'll show you in a second, if I go to this one, you can see the two. You've got this structure over here, which is hard to make out on this photo from 1949, but you can clearly see this area where Shannon's house is right here on this corner across from Moton School and across from Press Park. And then I've also signified where the Moton School is here. And then if you go to this picture, you can see that it's right in the heart of where the fires were in 1949. This is a picture from 1949. And so we've actually gotten a hold of quite a bit of aerial photography that we're going to link to what's going on there today to see if we can actually track some of the fires themselves and certainly what's happening in terms of the landscape with the dumping. This is from the Times Pick, and this just gives you a little different vantage point on the subdivisions itself. These are some pictures I took, and so I initially started working on this project in 2013, and a student of mine came to me and told me about doing some work with this community, and I was absolutely appalled because when I was in graduate school a very, very long time ago, almost 20 years ago now, we had read about Ag Street and read about what was going on with this community, and the idea that some, this is in Michigan where I did my PhD, some 20 years later, in this case it was 15 years later, nothing had happened. And the story is about in 2001 how nothing had happened in the previous 20 years. And here another almost 20 years, and now 20 years has elapsed, and nothing had actually been done. And so this is pictures I took in 2013 looking out on the site. And one of the interesting things that all the residents often talk about is they have these fences that are basically adjacent to all of their properties, right? So just behind me to the left are homes. And they said they couldn't tell if they were trying to keep people out of that area or whether they were trying to keep people in with this. And so it's a little frightening when you think about, looking at this each day from their homes. This is a picture taken out on the former Press Park, again, in 2013. There's actually my student there that was actually the one who told me about it. And again, dilapidated, falling down. There was all kinds of issues with pests. There was definitely squatters living in there. So there was a lot of drug use. There was a lot of things that were happening and the city eventually put up these fences in part to try to keep people out, of which of course didn't last very long. One thing I will say too is one of the meetings I went to probably only 4 or 5 months into my meeting with them, I was driving along this street, which again borders this open area that was not developed, and it had rained all afternoon, and across the street there was green and orange streaks that were clearly some kind of chemical that were basically running into the water system itself. And so seeing that so visibly, and I have not been able to recreate, we've seen some things like it, but for whatever reason that particular day I saw that. This is the Moton School, still standing. This is, this picture again is almost 7 years old, but this is what it looks like today. So Gordon Plaza today, city finally removed and cleaned up the blighted, dilapidated properties. It took a great deal of pressure from a lot of different people to finally get them to do that. Interestingly enough, they did it the day before that People's Assembly, which is a local activist organization in New Orleans, was having a huge event in which we probably had 300-400 people that came out to this. And just the day before, the city decided it was a good time to find, not the day before, a couple of weeks before, but by the day before, they cleaned up and mowed the lawns and did all these things that the residents have been asking for 2 decades, right, or a decade and a half, and hadn't been done. Calls for the EPA to kind of come in and kind of clean up. There's been estimates that they only did remediation on about 10% of the site. They didn't remove any of the chemical contaminants. They didn't do any excavation. It really just was remediation to cover up using a permeable barrier, and again, not even a very good one, and again, and done kind of patchwork. EPA says that no further action is needed based on their best estimates. And the one thing is, in terms of relocation, we'll talk a little bit about this real briefly. The EPA can't really do anything, right? They only have legislative power to actually follow up in terms of cleanup and remediation, but they can't actually move anybody based on environmental justice issues. Again, roughly 50 households that still live on the site, roughly 100 residents or so. April 2018, they filed this lawsuit again, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. And what this does, under the RCRA, it requires the federal government to take corrective action, and I put in quotes because this is always one of the difficult things to define, when residents are located on a known toxic site. So given that this site has been deemed by the EPA sufficient to be on the Superfund program, they know that they need the city in conjunction with the federal government, needs to take corrective action in terms of removing the people from the site. At least that's what the residents are arguing. And I think they have a pretty good case, at least according to the Environmental Law Clinic and the lawyers. The lawsuit, again, is currently held up in federal court due to a number of issues around standing involving the litigants and who actually can sue under this particular legislative act. So today, residents of Gordon Plaza want what they call a fair and just relocation, this fully funded fair and just relocation. And they're very clear about this, and it's important. This is the term they always use, and it's important. I'll tell you why. It means adequate compensation for their homes at a fair market price for a comparable non-contaminated property. So not what it's worth on the market right now based on the fact that it's been on a contaminated site for 40 years, but what would it be in another part of the city that would be comparable for, and many of these homes are very, very nice. You know, they're well constructed, beautiful homes, and so they would be worth, you know, $200,000 to $300,000 in most parts of the city, and so that's all they want is compensation for that. They do want the cost of relocation, right, for them to move, and some people would like to see some compensation for the hardships of living on the site. This is a little bit of a controversial thing because they don't want to push the city into providing for damages. They just want them to provide for that relocation to get them off the site. Not everybody agrees with this, and I think this will be one of the difficult things in terms of actually getting some relief in terms of the actual decision. All right, thank you. So I do have a couple of videos. I don't know, I mean, depending on time, they're short, but I don't know if I could show one or three. They're like 3 minutes each. Gina, what do you think?
Sure. If you want to pick the one you feel that's most applicable, I think that would be great. We actually have on our website, we can upload the rest if you'd like to do that way. It's up to you though.
That would be great. I'm just going to show, we in 2019, we did an exhibition. I say we, but I have a lab called Critical Visualization and Media Lab, in which my students, environmental studies students, sociology students from all over campus, we work together and work in advocacy roles with communities. And we did a year-long project with the residents and produced a museum exhibition in which the residents and People's Assembly, we collectively worked together to develop the exhibition. And so we produced some videos with the residents themselves. I'll show, if I can actually set it up, the opening sequence to the actual museum exhibition. So it's short. Let me make sure. Here's where I'll have problems in terms of sharing my screen. So what are you seeing right now, by the way?
Yes, we can still see you. It's the desktop. I'll let you know when it pulls up. I think you got it.
I think I'll try to pull this over into this one if it works. So now you're seeing this?
There we go. Perfect. Yes.
Okay, excellent. I apologize. I'm new to Google Meets, but I will.
What you feel in this moment.
It sounds a little bit low, and I apologize.
What you feel. Feel what you feel for the Garden Plaza residents. You guys have the same. Between this one too. So why the hell are you still there? Financially is my main reason, because I would have gone basically when my wife died. But that house cost me almost $200,000 on top of a toxic dump. Okay, now like Shannon said earlier, my daughter, actually my granddaughter, just purchased a house. I'm not sure, $350,000, and it wasn't in one of the supposedly better neighborhoods. So for me, as I got older, where the hell I'm gonna go? And you think I live up there for $350,000? I can't even afford to pay $2,000 on my car. So that's why I'm still here. But the average person will think, why are you there?
They should. Just to give you a sense, it's a prayer, and it's a prayer of thanksgiving, and it's a prayer of the things we'd like to see in our life. Oh, yes, you heard it. About
these houses is not worth the dime, but we still have to pay taxes on them. So I mean, you know, either go away, not come back to this house, and some of them still had notes on it during Katrina. some get. So either you're gonna pay your load off and just leave this house sitting there and start all over again. No, it would have been too hard. We couldn't afford that. Because first of all, like we said, we couldn't get money from World Home. We couldn't get money from FEMA because we was on a blackball list. But they had us on a map saying that we couldn't get no kind of funds for nothing.
It's great for our truly fully funded relocation effort in, as Angela said, healthy communities. Every time we say this, remember to say,
it's not fair. It's not fair at all. Somebody should make that wrong right.
And
I'm sorry that it's come down to this administration, but it's the city's fault. It's the federal government's fault. So somebody should make that wrong right.
Yeah, and just to be clear, that all the work that was done by my students who were predominantly. I mean, we had a couple of graduate students, but predominantly undergraduates who put together all of the filming and did the interviews and everything on that project, which was really great. It turned out wonderful. I was really proud of the work they did.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. That's
Sure.
incredible.
Thank you.
How long did they work on that project for then, your students with you?
We only had 4 months. What happened was there was a project there was an installment that was supposed to go in. Latia Ruby Frazier, who does this amazing stuff in environmental justice and social justice photography, she didn't need the entire museum space, and so they approached us in April and told us we had to August to produce. We had done some filming and footage prior to that, but we did it all really basically starting in May. Really, I mean, when students got out of school, and so over the summer. And it was I've never worked with a museum or curated anything in my life, and so it was a very interesting experience to be able to kind of take what we had developed and put it to use and actually do it again with the community group itself, which was great. I mean, it was constant meetings with the community, with the organization, with People's Assembly, who's this activist organization, and us to ensure that it was something that the residents wanted and felt good about, and so that's how we did it.
Wow. Oh my goodness. That's remarkable. That really is. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. That was so eye-opening. I know I for sure took so much away from that. I wasn't even aware of half of that. But does anyone else have any Q&A, any questions you'd like to ask?
We have a question. We have a question in the chat. Is there anything Mayor Cantrell is doing to help these people, since former Mayor Landry didn't do much?
That's a really good question, and this has happened quite often, and it happened with Mayor Cantrell. It has happened with a number of other politicians when they're either up for re-election or if they're moving to a new position. And there were state legislators, there was federal legislators who come and visit with them and talk with them and use it as kind of a moment. They hold a press conference, those kinds of things. So this happened time and time again. So when Cantrell was running, they had approached her about this and said, this is an issue. Is there something you could do about it? And again, there's the People's Assembly, which is this activist organization, community group within the city, has a lot of members, and they were constantly kind of putting pressure on the mayor when she was running, or for both of the candidates, everybody involved, and it's true of city council as well. What are you doing about this? Are you making any changes? She said she would do something. She was aware of it. She got elected, didn't do anything for a while. And then in 2019, there at the Essence Fest, there was a huge layout that was done on their site about it, in which this was brought to the mayor's attention, and so she actually then shot a short video, put it on Twitter, that basically said, I understand what's happening with you all. I'm looking into it. I'm doing something. I promise we'll take some action, and I promise that I'll have a meeting with you, even though they had requested meetings with her for months. And so that all happened, and then 4 months later, nothing had happened. And so initially enough, when we were doing our exhibition, the mayor was coming in and seeing the previous exhibition, the Persister exhibition, and if you had a chance to see, it was wonderful, on mass incarceration, formerly incarcerated women. She was coming to visit this in a private screening, and she ran into the residents in the hallway when they were coming for a meeting for us to do the new exhibition. So then they said, oh yeah, by the way, there's the next exhibition is going to be on Gordon Plaza. So kind of put even more pressure on her. And she didn't do anything, again, for another 4 or 5 months. And then there was a press conference that was held down in front of the city hall. And when she heard about it, they called out all the news. She said she would finally meet with them in person. And so while the press conference was supposed to go on, they went up and met with the mayor, came back down, told the press that it looks like the mayor's interested in doing something. She wants to move ahead. She's talking about putting together what do you call it, like an ad hoc group that'll deal with an ad hoc committee. And that was over a year ago, and nothing has happened since then. So yeah, it's really just been stalling for sure by the mayor. And you know, it's like I understand from a legal and kind of policy perspective why she probably doesn't want to do anything, both because there's federal litigation that's already pending, and also because there's concerns that, you know, and this is the work that I'm doing, is looking at sites that are similar to this, of which there's many on you know, not quite as egregious as what's happened with this particular community, but there are a lot of other neighborhoods in which there's toxic sites throughout the city. And so certainly that opens up the door for other people to sue. I mean, personally and professionally, of course, I think they should remediate and provide whatever's necessary to protect people, regardless of whether it's Gordon Plaza or other places. Gordon Plaza is clearly the place where we have a lot of detailed information, and we certainly understand what's happening, I think, much more clearly. So yeah, so long story short, the mayor has talked about it quite a bit and used it as a chance to put stuff on Twitter, but has not really done anything formally, for sure.
Anyone still living there?
Yeah, I mean, there's still those 50 households that are still living there. There's actually, I told you briefly about what used to be a kind of retirement elderly facility that was closed down and razed and tore down, and then somebody bought that property and put a new housing or a new apartment complex on it. So there's actually like 16 new units on that site. And then again, as I mentioned just briefly, somebody sold 2 homes and purchased it down the street from where Shannon lived, and they actually went to this gentleman and said, you know, this is like a Superfund site that you just bought up 2 homes on. And he was like, no, what? Well, you know, and that's the interesting thing about disclosure, right? You know, most times you don't, you know, disclosing lead, right? The idea of lead paint, which is required. You aren't required to do many things when you sell a home. There's things you can't do, like you can't lie, right, about if you know that, you know, but if you haven't tested on your piece of property and have that evidence, then you're not required to do anything. And so you don't have to tell somebody that, by the way, you know, you live on basically a toxic landfill. And so that's really frightening, you know, when you think about that too.
Oh my goodness, that's remarkable. I have a quick question to add to that. So this is such a deep-rooted issue, and it's been going on for ages for you, at least for, you know, you and your work in it. So what gives you hope through all the opposition that you're facing through this on a day-to-day basis?
I mean, you know, I for me, the issue, of course, is the community, you know, and that's kind of the primary thing. And even though, you know, I've told them, and I continue to work and move towards a book. I have like a book manuscript I'm working on. You know, I still, like, my first inclination is always to support them in whatever way I can, and that was the idea behind all this. So, I feel certainly they have hope at times. I mean, I think that that's true within, you know, not all of them, and certainly as people continue to pass away. You know, again, there's been 3 or 4 deaths in the last year and a half or 2 years. I think it makes it hard for them, and so I think for me, it's hard to look at that and have hope because of that, because I feel like these things are continuing to happen. The gentleman that was at the beginning of that opening, you know, he lost his wife, and he said to me very explicitly, my wife would probably still be alive if we hadn't decided to move here, you know. And so that really is so disheartening. But for him, it's like, this is all he has. Like, this is his home. This is the only thing he has left. This is where he had children and lived with his wife. And and so he doesn't want to leave until they give him what he deserves in terms of just funding relocation for that. It is hard to think that it's been 40 years, and it's certainly been 30 years since they've known explicitly that this is a problem, and it hasn't. Nothing's changed, to a certain extent. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard, and also because I work with a lot of other communities upriver between here and Baton Rouge, and certainly I see this happening in a lot of other places as well. And so that makes it really, really hard, because it really is, there's just one community after another. Where the more that we look at these issues, the more that we're aware of these issues, the more time we spend doing work in this area, the more that we know that there are more and more communities who are facing these issues everywhere. And so that does make it difficult. But I mean, it's both why I do what I do, in terms of the work I do. And so I guess that's the important thing. And I feel like, and that's why I do these talks, because I feel like I want to make sure that people understand what's happening, because there may be probably a lot of you that never heard about this. And so I want to make sure people do understand that it's happening and are aware of it, and hopefully can actually do something, to help out in some small way.
We have one more question in the chat. Is this one more thing that is made harder by the pandemic? Is it harder to reach the people and gather for informative sessions and such?
Yeah, absolutely. And they've had a couple of events that was, luckily, everybody was wearing masks. It was spread out, socially distanced in a way that I think still ran risk for sure. And certainly, we know that there's quite a bit of evidence out there, public health, environmental health, that people who are facing immune issues, respiratory issues, and many of the things that these residents are facing are more susceptible, right, to COVID issues. My understanding is there hasn't been any severe cases or deaths that have been attributed to it. That isn't the case in places like St. James and St. John the Baptist and St. Gabriel and other places that I work, where I know there have been communities that have, there have been community members who have died from COVID that probably are in some way related to immune issues, right, respiratory issues. It has made it hard for us to do the work that we had planned to do with them. We actually I'm working with a couple of my students to try to set up social distance video, in which we shoot from about 20 feet away, but set up the sound system and then have the resident or person step in, shoot the video, and then kind of do it at a distance. We're also doing things like sending recording devices to community members and having them record things for audio. We're doing some Zoom stuff as well. We're kind of experimenting with that. Certainly, the pandemic has both created a lot of challenges for both the residents to keep pushing for the issue and for me to keep doing the work that I've been trying to do. But it also makes it super interesting to think about how we can do things slightly differently too. That may actually help in terms of doing more distance kind of research and advocacy. And that's kind of with my lab, it's kind of important we kind of understand, because I work with communities as far as Alexandria and Lake Charles and stuff like that. So this might make an opportunity for us to do this kind of work more often remotely, which would be nice too. Yeah. So it's been both a challenge, and I know, again, some communities in Louisiana have been really hard hit in terms of death and illness for sure.
Wow, and that's amazing. I'm so glad you can spread their awareness, and people especially like me, I had no idea, this was going on in New Orleans. I've been there, I don't know how many times, we live here. So that's amazing. That's really amazing.
Yeah.
Is there any more questions, or I think that was the last one?
That's the last one in the chat.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. Last one right there. Yeah, last one. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate that. And Dr. Christopher, that was very inspiring. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
we'll be posting the recording on our webpage.
Okay.
So you can all go check it out and see the extra videos if you want to send those to me, and I can upload them for everyone. But yeah, this concludes our today's Green Talk. So thanks everyone for joining, and I hope you all stay safe.
Take care. Thank you.